Welcome back to Google DeepMind, the podcast. I'm Professor Hannah Fry. Now, there is broad consensus across the tech industry, governments and society that as AI becomes more and more embedded in every aspect of our world, regulation is essential. But once you start to decipher what that regulation should actually look like, well, then agreement becomes much more elusive. How do we protect against the harms of new technologies without stifling innovation? How can we give AI the autonomy that it needs to be able to solve complex problems while retaining human control? And is it possible to keep development transparent and accountable to the public, even as companies fiercely guard their competitive secrets? Well, in our episode with Demis Hassabis at the start of the season, we talked about his general views on the regulation of AI. But in this episode, I want to dig a bit deeper into the nuances of this topic. I want to take time to explore the arguments and the counter-arguments to the different forms of regulation that are on the table. Now, of course, to address the elephant in the room, this is the Google DeepMind podcast. So it's important to be upfront about the fact that my guest today is going to be offering us one particular view of AI regulation. However, I want to promise you that as far as I possibly can, I am going to try and make this a robust discussion and leave it up to you, the audience, to decide where you stand on these issues. And so, with that in mind, I am delighted to be joined today by Nicklas Lundblad, Google DeepMind's Head of Public Policy and Public Affairs. Nicklas has spent years working at the intersection of technology and policy at Google, navigating the intricate landscape of AI's evolution and regulation. Nicklas, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, okay, in terms of your current role at the moment, I know that you spend a lot of time talking to industry leaders, talking to governments, to the public about perceptions of AI. How would you describe the kind of the current public mood, as it were, around the subject?
I think it's hesitant, but also hesitantly optimistic. And then you find the people who are hesitantly pessimistic. So it's almost like evenly cut, I think. To some degree, there are a lot of people who hope that this technology can help us solve some of the knotty and complex problems that we have encountered, climate change, pandemics, other kinds of things that we really need to deal with. And there are a lot of people who say, well, yes, it might be able to do that, but at what price? And so you end up with these two different groups.
And where do you sit between those two?
I am hopeful. I also think that artificial intelligence to me has a very natural place in progress overall. Because what we're doing is what we've done for a long time is that we have bought progress and welfare at the price of complexity. And as social complexity increases massively, we need new ways of dealing with it, hence technological and social innovation. And so the way that artificial intelligence fits into this very, very simple picture is that it is a way of dealing with increased complexity and allows the unlocking of further progress. And to me, that's absolutely essential. There are like two really interesting views about artificial intelligence, two stories that are in tension. One of them is that we do this because we can, the sort of Frankenstein story. We shall become as gods. That's what we're doing, right? And that story has had its time, and there are a lot of people who are sort of worried about that story. The other story, which is as extreme, but on the other side, is no, we do this because we must. The kinds of problems we have are not going to be solvable without this kind of technology.
I mean, on both of those, there's sort of, I guess, this underlying idea that there is no choice, really, that we're marching forwards regardless of almost intention. I mean, It's like we have to.
Oh, they're both extremes, and I would not say that I think any one of them is right. But I think it's always helpful to think about society and think about politics as sort of a reasonable disagreement between two extreme views, and then see where you can get to the middle, what the sort of optimal way of thinking about this is. I think the story of we do this because it's going to unlock progress has been undertold. So that's why I'm more interested in that, perhaps.
Do you think there's been a shift in public mood? I mean, with the sort of explosion of generative AI onto the scenes, and now it's really, I think, a topic that everybody is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. Have you noticed a mood shift as a result?
Oh, there's been many mood shifts. I mean, one of the things that happen with almost all technologies is that you first encounter an enormous sort of euphoria almost, where you go like, oh, this is fantastic, it's going to solve all my problems. And then you sink into deep, deep depression because
like
it didn't.
The Gartner hype cycle,
It's
right?
the Gartner hype cycle, or the way that José Borges put it in The Library of Babel, where he said, funnily, in this short story, which is beautiful, he writes about how they find a library with all of the possible permutations of the alphabet, all possible books. And he says, and they were so joyful because they had found all possible books. And then a few sentences later he writes, and then they became very depressed because they have found all possible books. And that sort of that thing characterizes almost all technology cycles as well, I think.
That we get excited first.
We get excited, and then we go to the trough of disillusionment, to use your Gartner hype cycle, and then to the plateau of sort of reasonable expectations. And I think generative AI, to some degree, is probably going through exactly that hype cycle. And we now see a lot of articles about, where's the productivity growth? Where's the economic boost that we hoped for? Is the investment worth it? And that is something that we saw around the internet as well. We've seen it around computers. We've seen it around all kinds of technologies for the last at least 2 centuries.
And we should expect to see it going forwards as well, I guess, with the new technologies that are to come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think so.
All right. I guess it might make sense for us just at the beginning of this to really sketch out where we are at the moment in terms of the landscape of regulation on artificial intelligence. Could you give us a sort of a brief overview of where we are?
Of course. No, so we're currently in a land of many different kinds of solutions being tried. So in the US, for example, the Biden administration decided to put forward what it's called an executive order, which is sort of a presidential decree, in which they set out a lot of different rules for the different agencies. They wanted guidelines, they wanted testing, they had a ton of different rules that they set out around artificial intelligence. But they were mostly sort of industry-led, and they were industry-close. And then you have the UK that has said that we believe that the best way to approach this is to look at sectoral legislation, which is, how is this actually going to be used when it's used in healthcare, when it's used in education, when it's used in different kinds of sectors in the economy. And then you have the European Union that shows this broad horizontal regulatory approach in which they said, we are going to look at the risk that these systems present widely to society. And then of course you have China, who has been regulating as well, and the way they've been regulating has been mostly around figuring out how does this technology shift power in a society, which is really interesting. So if you look at the kind of regulation that China has put in place, it has been around a lot about information power. So what do we do with recommendation algorithms, for example? That's been one of their first foci. And so I think that's sort of an interesting approach as well. So you have these 4 different ongoing experiments in the regulatory space, and we're learning from each and every one of them. And I think it's actually not a horrible approach to a new technology, because there's so much evidence that we need to gather, not just about the technology, but also about the regulatory fit of these different kinds of rules.
So, okay, I'm going to ask quite a basic question, a sort of a foundational one, as it were. Do you think that AI as a distinct technology needs regulating sort of independently or of other technologies?
I don't think that we ever only regulate the technology. And the view I have is quite socio-technical. I think we regulate the uses of technology, the design of technology, the deployment of technology, but I don't think that you can talk about regulating a technology like purely the technology itself. And that is as it should be, because to some degree what we are regulating is also how a technology affects power. The German philosopher Hans Jonas had a beautiful way of phrasing this, where he said, all use of technology is the exercise of power. And so the use of technology is what we're usually thinking about when we think about regulation. Another thing that I think is quite important to bring all into our discussion here is that regulation is not the same as legislation. Mm-hmm. Those are different. Mm. One of the best regulatory models that has come up in the last couple of decades is one that was launched by Professor Lawrence Lessig in a book that he wrote back in 1999, I want to say, called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And in this book, he sort of outlines regulation as consisting of 4 different components. One is, of course, law, legislation, right? We have laws and they regulate. Another is architecture. The way we actually build technology matters. A third is markets. because economic pressures also regulate technology. Some things are possible, some things are not possible. And then lastly, the fourth is norms. So these four forces of regulation impact the situation. And this will become important later, because when we talk about regulating a technology or regulating AI, we can't just say we should regulate AI without also discussing, okay, how does that regulation distribute across these four different forces?
I want to pick up on something you said a minute ago, actually, because you said that when it comes to regulation, we regulate the applications of technology rather than the technology itself. But that's not always true, right? I'm thinking here about CRISPR, for instance, the gene editing technology, which has regulations on the technology itself, sort of independent of its applications because of the recognition of the potential harm to ecosystems or I don't know, to human health or human life, if you allow this kind of free use of the technology. I mean, there are situations where the technology itself is regulated, right?
But you're still regulating the use, because the reason you're regulating the technology or that you're going at the architecture in this particular case is because you're worried about the ecosystems. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine that you sort of say, here's how this technology can be designed. Mm. Here's how this technology can be developed. But it's usually always going to be in that socio-technical frame that we discussed.
Okay, but how about, I'm trying to think of counterexamples though, because I sort of think that there are some that to me, it doesn't seem completely black and white that it's always the applications, not the technology. I'm thinking about, I don't know, like plutonium, for instance. I mean, there's very strict rules about plutonium transport, about, how it can be used by whom.
How it can be used.
How it can be used, true, very true.
But I don't think you're wrong. I think you will find different kinds of regulatory interventions across the entire ecosystem. Let's rephrase it and say, okay, maybe it's not about use or applications and technology. Maybe what we're always looking for in regulation, maybe what we always want to think about is harm. So what is a potential harm? And then we find a place in the socio-technical context where we believe that we can best prevent that harm. That gives us another frame of thinking about this. And I'm not wed to any frame. I think that's a really good frame to think in too. Because if you focus on harm instead, and you can say in the CRISPR case, for example, we believe there can be harm to ecosystems. The best way for us to prevent that is to look at the CRISPR technology's design.
If we kind of apply that back to AI, how do you regulate the harms without regulating the technology, if you see what I mean? What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, one thing you can do, let's take a very concrete example, because it's always good to do this with examples. Say you want to regulate bias. And you say bias is a harm. If the system is deeply biased, there's a harm here. The first thing we then have to do, and this is quite helpful, is we have to say, okay, what does that harm look like? Well, we believe that somebody could have a decision made against them that is sort of negative for them because the system is biased in some way. And so we want to prevent that harm of the individual not being admitted to school, not getting sort of a welfare check or whatever we want to do. So what we're looking at is that kind of harm. Now, the next question we should ask in a regulatory context is, where can we best prevent this? Now we have choices. Now we can say, I think the best way to do this is to make sure that there is never any bias in a data set. That's a technical choice, right? We choose to go all the way back to the data set. And we say the data set can under no circumstances contain bias. Now, that is very, very, very hard, but it's a choice we can make. We can say that's what we want to do. Another choice we can make is all decisions that go through an algorithm of some kind, or where a data set can be used, or where there's a risk for bias, need to be reviewed by two people. That's another regulatory solution to that same kind of problem. Now, the question we're faced with then is, okay, what's the most effective intervention we can make here? Let's take a very ineffective intervention. We can say, yes, the data can be biased and there's going to be no human review, but the algorithm that uses the data has to be built in such a way that it excludes all possibilities of bias. I don't even know how I would start doing that. But you can say that that kind of regulation is what you could come up with, because you have data, you have algorithms, and you have humans in this system. So as we try to prevent the harm, we figure out where in the system we most effectively can prevent the harm.
Does that not require you knowing in advance what the potential harms will be?
Oh, that's such a good question. And such a good point, because that is what's truly hard with new technology, right? When we have emerging technology, we don't exactly know what the harms are. And that's why we end up trying to use certain blanket principles for new technology. One of them, for example, is the cost-benefit principle, principle, where we try to figure out what the possible costs are with some approximation of the probability of unknown harm, which is super hard. And other is the precautionary principle, where we say that you have to show that there's no downside to this particular technology under these particular conditions before you deploy it.
Which is what the UK Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology said. They said that social media platforms, for instance, must prove their products are safe before release, which is exactly as you're describing.
Yes, which creates another kind of evidentiary problem, because it's really hard to prove a negative. So what you end up with then is that you have to prove to some standard, right? You have to prove to some probability that this technology is not going to be harmful, which may actually be quite a good standard in many cases. But it can also be a highly restrictive standard depending on how high you put the bar for saying that there will be no harm here.
Give me an example. In what situation would it make it difficult?
Let's take a very simple example. Scanning X-rays for cancer. And you say, okay, we're only going to actually release this system if we can prove that it will never have or miss any kind of cancer. Right? That's a super simple precautionary principle example for you. And that standard is too high. And the standard we should set is it should probably outperform human doctors. That's a better standard to think through.
We should be absolutely clear about this. Why is that standard too high?
Oh, I think it's too high because then you deploy no system, right? Because there's no system that can do that. You can never prove that a system will be 100% accurate in any real-life situation. So that's too high a bar. And then you can go down and you can say, okay, it should have these different kinds of, it should prove these different kinds of accuracy. One you can say is that it should be more accurate on average than human doctors are on average. Another is that you can say, okay, if human doctors are also reviewing, you can actually go a little bit lower. And you can say it just needs to have a signal value that helps the human doctor to interpret the X-ray. And so you can say it doesn't have to be accurate 100% of the time. It can be accurate 40% of the time, even if the doctors are accurate 80% of the time, because the extra signal value might boost their 80 to 82 in the hybrid system. So you end up with these sort of interesting questions about where do you put the bar?
That's a bar on benefit, though, right? Because there's also the bar on the other side, on cost. And deciding that in advance is well, how do you decide where the bar is for potential costs that you're willing to accept?
You can take the cancer example again, the X-ray example. You can say that it should absolutely never have a false positive, because that creates harm in the sense that it uses the healthcare system unnecessarily. And for the individual who gets the diagnosis, it's like a personal catastrophe and so on. That's a challenge, right? Because we know there's no system that can fulfill that standard. And then we scale back from there to find the standard that we think is reasonable.
If we expand this out to a slightly broader use of technology, I mean, the example of sort of sensitivity and specificity and false positives and false negatives is a very clear example of where the potential harms are. But I'm thinking about more broadly about where you would get unexpected harms. For instance, I'm thinking about the 2008 financial crisis here, and how a lot of that problem was caused by this sort of the same models being used over and over again, and no one quite noticing that meant that there was this common vulnerability across them, this kind of common weakness. And then only after the sort of big catastrophe happened that it's like you can go back and pick through the rubble and decide what the regulation should have been. How can you prevent those kind of big global events from happening in technology where you don't necessarily understand all of the harms in advance?
It's very hard, is the answer to the question. What you can do, though, is that you can try as far as you can go to do scenario planning, to do red teaming, to go through what the technology can do, and figure out how it fails. One of the most important questions about any technology is actually how it fails. And one of the things that we can do, and that we consistently try to do in technology, is to design graceful failure. If you think about an airplane, for example, it fails gracefully to the extent that it can even glide if all of its systems go down. And one of the things that I think people are thinking actively about is how can you replicate graceful failure in other kinds of systems? And it doesn't just have to be AI, it can be any kind of system really that we rely on. So we're faced with, as soon as we move outside, and you're quite right, when we move outside of the small clinical example I gave you, the uncertainty increases. And then at some point, we have to decide as a society, how much uncertainty are we willing to tolerate for what progress?
Underlying what you're saying there is almost this implication that we have to accept that there is some probability of catastrophic failure, that we can't mitigate against everything. I mean, even the sort of the looking for graceful failures, as you say. I mean, there's no way that we can sort of sit here and say we are sure that we are going to build technology that does not risk existential crisis even.
No, we can never be sure. And that's a part of the human condition, I think. Uncertainty is a part of the human condition, at least if we want progress. And I think progress actually exacerbates that uncertainty. I think Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian economist, at some point wrote, "Man has never been the ruler of her own fate." And that is the reason we have progress. And so there's a difficulty here, of course. And I think I'm not saying that so we should sort of with abandon throw ourselves out into the darkness. But what I am saying is that I think the notion of progress, the notion of welfare, the notion of my kids having it better than I do, does come with a bit of uncertainty. And if I want that, then I also need to tolerate managed uncertainty.
But I sort of wonder, I wonder whether there's a question here about, must we do it at all? Like, if doing so means that there's unavoidable uncertainty, then what about just not doing it?
Yeah, absolutely. We can do that. What we do then as a society or as a polity is to say we choose not to progress. From this point on, we will conserve what we have, what we'll do nothing new, and take on no new risk, although risk is what drives societies forward. And I think that's a political choice. I mean, a lot of, it's interesting, right? Because a lot of what we do in policy and when we discuss regulation is that we're constantly exploring what John Rawls calls reasonable disagreements. So what are the sort of two positions that are warring with each other on this particular point? And on this point, there's one position that says, no, we should go for degrowth. We should rescale our societies. There's a lot to be had in an agricultural economy, right? That's the extreme version of that. And there's one that says, no, we need to go to the stars and we need to figure out how the universe works. And we need to really make sure that we continue to progress as human beings and build the future. Those two are both defensible from like a foundational ethical perspective. And at some point, we just have to choose. And not choose binarily, but choose where on the spectrum between the two we are.
But then the we choose, I mean, that's quite a big, like, all-encapsulating thing because there's no sort of opt-out here, you know? I mean, this is like we, as all of humanity collectively, we're either developing these technologies or we're not.
Yeah, we are. And I mean, and I think that's an unavoidable truth to some degree. And that's why I think it's so important to also invest in democracy. And this is sort of a side point, but it's the way we make regulation, the methods whereby which we regulate technology actually matter. I do think that democracies have a better way of discovering people's real views on this and respecting and representing us collectively than, for example, authoritarian systems have.
I do also want to talk about the role of private companies in all of this, because, I mean, of course, we're having this conversation within the four walls of Google DeepMind. What do you think the role should be in having private companies to shape this regulation?
I think ideally, if we do it right, the way that sort of all of these policy discussions work, or what's sometimes called lobbying works. If lobbying really works for society's best, it's a knowledge exchange equation. So we give knowledge around how this technology works, and in exchange for that, we get influence over how the regulation is shaped. And that is the role I think private companies should take to a large degree in all emerging technologies. And that's not just true for AI; it's true for life sciences, for example. There is this knowledge asymmetry where a lot of the knowledge sits in the private sector, and we need to even it out. And I don't mean to say, sometimes you hear people say we need to educate policymakers. I think that's wrong. I think that we have to have some kind of mutual dialogue here where we educate about the technology, but policymakers educate us about democracy, institutions, and values in ways that actually can help us think about, okay, how do we shape this technology? A good example is we understood early on that there was going to be requirements to figure out how to deal with content that was synthetically produced. And so those values, those political sort of interests in some way also inform the work that we have done on a very technical thing called SynthID. So figuring out how watermarking works, how we can make it possible to distinguish real content from content that's been synthetically generated is something that you learn if you have this ongoing dialogue between the political and the technical, between the public and the private.
But I mean, is that a universal belief among the tech industry? Some people, I mean, there is sort of a push for, local expertise, internal expertise being kind of the ultimate thing to be considered, isn't it?
I think the more you can build not just expertise, but also understanding of this technology in the public sector, the better it is. So I'm not opposed to that. But you put your finger on something that's important. Of course, not everyone in the technology sector thinks the same way. We have lots of different perspectives. And it also depends a little bit on where your ideological sort of home is. An interesting example of a difference that we've seen in the last 10 years or so is the difference between internet policy and AI policy. Because if you think back to the early days of the internet, to sort of 1996, the internet ethos amongst people who discussed policy and politics and the internet was highly libertarian, extremely libertarian. In 1996, John Perry Barlow publishes the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which is a fantastically bombastic document. It sort of says, "You weary giants of steel and flesh, leave us alone." That's sort of that's the basic tonality in the early internet policy debates. In the AI policy debates, it's really different. Because if you speak to young engineers today, if you speak to anyone working on this, if you speak to researchers, they say, no, this technology is powerful enough that it needs to be regulated in some way. And we have AI companies persistently saying that this technology needs to be regulated. Now, that begs another question. When you say that, you should be able to answer how. And I think that's a challenge, and we'll probably get to that. But I do think that one of the things that you see is that the ethos is different, and that's really important.
But there are some who think that self-regulation is it should be the main lever that gets used as we go forwards.
Self-regulation can be good for two reasons. One is because you want to keep sort of your ability to do whatever you want. So self-regulation becomes almost a defensive move. You say, yes, we'll self-regulate, right? Another reason for self-regulating can be that there is so much we don't know that we need to make sure that we sort of constantly change the regulation. Self-regulation is easier to change than legislation is. But I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. Self-regulation with transparency allows for legal review and auditing, for example. So you can imagine different ways in which we as a company could test our models and then review openly how the models have been tested, like the AI Act says. And then there's a possibility for legal and auditing and review of that from outside of the company. So you combine them in different ways.
I guess one of the other sort of big counter-arguments is that this whole picture is really further coloured by the pursuit of profit, in the sense that companies who have a hand in deciding regulations, can you trust that they're doing so for public good or for sort of competitive advantage?
And the profit motive is always going to be something that we should take into account. But it shouldn't disqualify companies from actually having some moral authority. And I think the problem is that often the profit motive is used as this blanket argument saying you only think about your profit. And you can't do that, because if you only think about your profit and mercilessly drive profit, you're not going to be able to recruit the right talent. People are not going to want to work on a company like that. You're not going to be able to do deals with others in the industry who want to be seen as responsible and respectable. There's a huge difference between a company that's trying to maximize its profit quarter to quarter and a company that's trying to maximize its profits over 100 years. And in order to do that, you actually have to be a good player. It's like any prisoner's dilemma that you reiterate, right? The tit-for-tat rule. What turns out to be most sustainable in a repeated game is to be a trusted and somewhat good player. I'm more worried about something else, actually, if I can sort of put on my worry hat. And that is that I think currently investments in science from the private sector, and this is true for a lot of different sectors, are much, much higher than investments from the public sector. And I think that over the last couple of decades, the prioritization of science as a public venture has sadly fallen down a lot. I actually would like to see more public investment in science, more public work. We've been, for example, deeply supportive of the notion of a national AI resource in different shapes or forms around the world, where we believe that public investment in this technology will actually give more public knowledge, will give more kind of insight in how the technology works, and that will be a good thing.
Do you think then, with that as the background, there is a risk that we'll end up in a future where AI is in the hands of a very small number of companies?
there's always that risk. And I think one of the things that we see is that for many of the other markets or sectors that we look at, we have this structure where you have a few companies that are in some way or shape sort of very important in that sector. You see it in pharma, you see it in telco, you see it in energy, you see it in all of these different sectors. And the question then is, if that is the case, is that then harmful? Or is that okay? Is it okay that that's sort of an effect of industrial organization and economic pressures? Is it something that holds back innovation? Is it something that sort of reduces consumer welfare? That's the question you have to ask. I think I'm less worried about the market structure, where you could say you have 4 or 5 really large pharma companies or energy companies, than I am about how that impacts the overall change and progress in those sectors.
Okay, I want to get onto some really concrete examples of regulation, those 4 different approaches exactly as you described. Of course, the EU's AI Act came into force earlier this year, and they've really gone for this risk-based approach. So at the one end, the kind of unacceptable risks are things like social credit scores, and then down at the other end, the very low-risk stuff for things like chatbots. Do you think this is broadly a good approach?
So I think it's a good one, to start with that. I think it's actually, when the Commission originally published its proposal, I think it was a really thoughtful way to approach a problem that is very much like the one we discussed. What do you do with the technology when it's hard to predict the harms? And so in some way, I think it's a really good way to think about things. Where is the risk? And then tune the regulation to the risk. I think the downsides, of course, is to how you assess risk and who assesses it. It's been pointed out by people that if companies get to assess their own risk entirely, then that's going not to work, to your point about self-regulation. Now, that's not what the regulation says. The regulation has other views about this. Another argument against a risk-based regulation, of course, is that you're not looking at all at the upside or the benefits. So you say, this is a high risk, but what if it's high reward? Say we have a high risk application that can be used to, we go back to the medical case, cure a disease or sort of massively improve a situation. Shouldn't we then at some point factor in the fact that it's so high reward and say, okay, we're going to regulate this, but we're also going to give you a little bit of leeway because we think that risk alone isn't the best metric here. That criticism could be leveled against the system, but I think that it's probably even harder to assess reward than risk. So it becomes even messier to do that. And that is what you're seeing at work here, if you sort of scratch the surface, is a tension between the American and the European approach. Because the American approach is the cost-benefit principle, whereas you have the precautionary principle in Europe. And the precautionary principle says, let's look at the risk. The cost-benefit principle says, let's look at the reward and the risk and see how they compare.
I do wonder a little bit about that difference between the US and the EU approach, because I guess now there's a reasonable chance that those executive orders will be overturned. Is there a chance that we could end up in a situation where there is this big gap between the types of regulation that you get in the US and the types of regulation that you have within the EU, which then sort of exacerbates the winner-takes-all thing, where really you get this huge advantage in innovation for American companies?
I think there's a definite risk that regulation becomes determinative in sort of what kind of economic growth you get, what kind of welfare you get. And I do think that that's one of the things that the European model will test. And we will see if that kind of regulatory model can carry the kind of innovation that Europe wants. The hypothesis that the European regulator has is that a clear playing field, sort of clear rules, and a way to access the entire European market that's been designed for the European AI Act is going to boost innovation, and it's going to boost investments, it's going to boost the use of this technology because people now know what to do. And their hypothesis then is that the US model will create so much uncertainty, and with US litigiousness and liability, it's actually going to make it much slower than if you had a comprehensive piece of legislation. Those hypotheses will be tested out in real time.
Because, I mean, there are some situations where actually regulation has accelerated innovation. I mean, I'm thinking here about emissions on vehicles ending up causing innovation in the electric vehicle market, right? I mean, as a Formula One fan, the years that are most exciting in terms of innovation are the ones where new regulations come in. And as you say, people have this framework within which they know that they have to innovate.
Yeah, I think that can be absolutely true. That depends on that regulation being very specific, setting out a space that is viable. And there are examples of this in technology regulation too. I think that the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, for example, which was put in place very early on, had certain rules for what you had to do in order to escape liability. And one of the things was that you had to have some way for people to claim their content on the platform, which led to Content ID, which is one of the greatest innovations that YouTube have brought to the table. And so you can see how that piece of innovation was encouraged by the way that legislation was set up. That's hard to do, but it's absolutely possible to do.
Do you think then that we will see similar types of innovation? I mean, I'm thinking here about some of the generative AI stuff, Synth ID you mentioned earlier, which has come about as a way to identify AI generated content. Do you think that the EU regulations will force sort of wider adoption of those kind of ideas and maybe even a wider agreement on standardized systems for them?
I hope so. I'm not entirely sure that we will see that, because one of the things that you require in order to get that innovative effect is that you require a certain precision. And currently, the European AI Act is still being negotiated in a code of practice. It's going to be implemented in all of the member states. So we don't know yet if it will be clear enough to drive that kind of innovation. I think the innovation on Synth ID and watermarking comes from a global political dialogue where you in the US, in some of the states, and in Europe, of course, have sought for a means to figure out how you can sort of bring back some way of assessing the authority or authoritativeness of content. And I think that's a good example of how regulation or regulatory concerns or policy concerns can drive innovation.
I mean, I guess there's also the sort of necessary but not sufficient argument here as well, which is that it's all very well sort of labeling, just as an example, AI generated content. But if you're not doing it in real time, then actually the harms can be caused. You can't just retrospectively label things.
And the entire approach of labeling things is interesting too, because we focus on the misinformation, on the fake information. And one of the things you can say is that that's going to be really, really, really hard because of the delay you mentioned or because of the amount of information. What we may want to do instead is to figure out, is there another way for us to assign authority to content? Can we actually say, not that this is misinformation or this is synthetic, but this is really authoritative? Because we have this flat information surface that we're struggling with, and finding out what's actually what or what's true in this flat information surface is really hard. Now, if you could build some peaks and valleys, and if you can make this into an authoritative landscape, then you could actually start to build in a way to sift out not just the fake, but also the highly valuable. And that's if you look at the early days of newspapers, that's actually what happened. You started with a plethora of different newspapers that were more or less libelous, every single one of them, right? Infamous scribblers, I think George Washington called them in the US, right? They had, they were just make stuff up. And then after a while, you saw the sort of evolution of publishing standards. You saw some of the companies say, this is printed in our newspaper, so it was really relevant. And you saw people building authority around content. They weren't trying to attack the bad stuff. They were trying to show you ways to the good stuff.
Yeah, I really like that idea. Although I also think that this is something that takes time, right? And newspapers, as a really lovely example, is something that developed over the course of decades, right? Rather than, the sort of situation that we're in now where things are changing in a lightning fast way. Trust takes time to build up. The EU actually also has this unacceptable risk category, right, which I guess includes things like social credit scores and lots of real-time biometric identification. And
those are interesting, and we should discuss them. I actually think it's quite useful for a society to say, here are some uses that we're absolutely not going to condone. Social scoring is one, for example. I think that's good. I think that is actually both helpful and healthy, and I agree with that being a prohibited category. And I think that part of the AI Act is actually very reasonable because it points to stuff that we do not want. And it's interesting because the European Union has done this in many different cases. It actually has selected not to have certain kinds of technology. It did with the prohibited categories of AI, but also historically, famously, it's done the same with GMOs.
How about within Google DeepMind then? Do you have certain applications that you consider off limits here?
We have our AI principles. So one example is that there are certain applications of weapons, etc., that we wouldn't consider. But generally, going to the AI principles and consulting them gives you a sense of how we try to balance the different equities here.
I do wonder about, in terms of particular projects, how do you decide at Google DeepMind which projects you will and won't get involved in? How does that decision process happen?
There's a set of principles against which we test ethically the different kinds of things we do. That is then taken to 2 different councils, actually, that look, review, interview the engineers, set out different conditions, and then give a green light or a yellow light or a red light and sort of say, generally, here's how you should think about this from our ethical perspective. So these ethical review boards is something that we're not the only ones who have them. There are others who have them too. They are essentially a way of looking at how different projects can be assessed, what we should do, and if we think if we should proceed with them or not.
If that's the frameworks that exist at the moment, I think it's probably also important to talk about frontier models. So this idea of like the most powerful AI models, kind of at the very cutting edge, and the risk that they might pose. So we got to talk to Demis to kick off this season, and he said that he would recommend kind of beefing up existing regulations at the moment in the domains where we have AI, but also kind of making sure that you understand and test the frontier models simultaneously. And then, he said, start regulating around that maybe in a couple of years' time. I mean, it's slightly unfair of me to give you a quote from Demis and then ask you to explain what he meant.
Yeah, but there you go. Happy to. Yes.
But there you go. Why in a couple of years? Why not now?
I think that the evidence base we have is simply too slim. I think what he is sort of hinting at is that if we get into the habit of testing these models now, when the capabilities are impressive but not dangerous, that will be a really good way for us to have built habits, to have built regulation, to have built institutions that can do this. In the UK, for example, the AI Safety Institute was put in place as a government initiative in the UK first, but now there are AI safety institutes in many places, to look at and understand more about foundation models or really powerful frontier models. And they've recruited scientists, recruited policy people to really figure out how the government can learn more about these models. And then you might see different kinds of other capabilities evolve through this particular testing work or through this sort of analysis that we're doing. And that in turn will help us to figure out what does good regulation look like. The challenge is the pace of evolution of these models. And you can see that if you do a retrospective and say, okay, let's assume that you were a regulator or a legislator and you're asked to regulate AI in 2015. That's 9 years ago, right? What do you think that you would produce? And I think that's sort of, if you do that, you see easily why he says, wait a couple of years. Because the knowledge we have, the evidence we're getting, all of that is going to be different in a couple of years. Even, I think, to some degree, the unit of analysis. One of the things that we have seen is a huge focus on this notion of the model as the object of regulation. And that is, while it's a sort of a helpful first approximation of where regulation should sit, one of the things we're seeing now is that as the effectiveness of the scaling laws seem to be diminishing, people are building several different models and then having them work together in different ways. So you get architectures that don't have a single model that is feasible to regulate, but where it's a collection or a set or a portfolio of models together that produces the capability. It's easy to see that those capabilities that are produced by 2 models will be different. It's a little bit like thinking about how would you say that you want to regulate a symphony orchestra? Do you regulate the guy with the triangle? Do you regulate the conductor? That seems to be like pretty fair. But at some point, the conductor also needs to make sure that everything else is regulated. And so I think to some degree we're moving into an architectural paradigm that may even challenge the notion that these frontier models in the singular are the right thing to regulate.
I mean, you said there a moment ago that we're at the point now where these models are impressive but not harmful. But then I think that there are some situations in which large language models can be harmful already, right? I mean, I'm thinking here in terms of amplification of misinformation. I'm thinking in terms of sort of bias and disinformation. I mean, Is sitting back and waiting until we have further information definitely the right approach? Or could we not sort of move now and be willing to be flexible as we go along?
Oh, you're right and I'm wrong. They can be harmful now. But I think one thing that's important is that I'm not recommending we sit back and wait. One of the things that Demis also often stresses is that we don't have the right benchmarks or the right tests to figure out how we assess what the models can actually do. And that means that we don't exactly know what the possible harms are. But this we can solve. And we can solve this by attacking the problem now. And that's why the scientific exploration and evaluation of models is going to be incredibly important to invest in and work with over the coming couple of years, together with the public sector and third parties, and together with other companies as well. And that's why we set up the Frontier Model Forum, which is an organization of different kinds of AI companies coming together to try to build these evaluations on a scientific basis.
So am I getting the picture here then that with these frontier models, with the sort of the real cutting edge of artificial intelligence, it's having the discussion about the safety before they're built, while they're built, and after they're built. Like it's kind of every step of the process.
Yes, and I do think that after is more important than it usually is, because there's only so much pre-testing you can do before you've actually built the artifact. If you think about in regulation, you often say that, should we have something be safe by design? Sort of make sure that it's absolutely safe from the outset, or should we have it be safe by testing? So we test it afterwards and see if it's safe. You do it differently for cars. Cars you test and you build them safe. You hope that the design is safe and then you test it a lot. This is even more so. What you want to do is you want to build it, then you want to understand it, you want to test it, you want to explore how it works. You also want to explore how it works in a socio-technical context.
Well, that's, I think, the important point, the difference between the example of cars, or I'm thinking pharmaceuticals as well, like, COVID vaccine, for instance, where you have the opportunity to test it before it gets embedded in society. Where you have like a very particular controlled environment. With some of these frontier models, that might not necessarily always be possible.
Well, I think you can not. So that's an interesting question. Can you test it before you release it? We do a ton of testing, and all AI companies do before we put anything out to the public or make it generally available. And that's one part of the processes that Demis talks about. Sort of we build the institutional habits of making sure that we test, we red team with selected third parties, we work with the AI safety institutes, and we have this sort of period where we test it. It's not as if we test it by throwing it out to market.
On that note, though, I mean, there are people who have said that actually we should be building kill switches into these things, and that actually perhaps that should even be part of regulatory control. Is that an insistence on that? What's your take on that idea?
I don't know what that would look like. I would have to look at some kind of computer science proof that shows me that a kill switch can be really effective. Now, if we're talking about a system that's sort of vastly more intelligent than us, then I think it's probably hard to build a kill switch into that system. I can, I can build a kill switch into my lamp. It's sort of the on-off button. That's fine. I can do that, right? My lamp is likely to not outsmart me often, and so I can do that. But what do I do with a system that is not just highly complex, but also distributed? The notion of a kill switch goes back to what we talked about before, that there's a single model we can regulate. Now, what if the model actually uses, say, 10, 20, 200,000 different kinds of nodes in a network? Where do you put the kill switch? The way that people now try to shut off the internet is by shutting it off at the border and essentially saying, we will have no internet whatsoever because it's highly distributed. A system like this, an AGI that is basically a network of different kinds of models, will be even more distributed and will have a natural tendency to allocate or reallocate its sort of tasks or its capabilities across this network if any piece of it is shut down.
If we do watch and wait, are there any emerging capabilities that you are particularly concerned about?
I think it's worth looking more closely at persuasion and deception, not because I think that they in themselves are extremely dangerous, but because we need to understand so much more about both persuasion and deception and how they work if there is technology or AI in the mix.
But this does sound like one area in which there are some very clear sort of blanket rules that might actually be useful. A model should always let you know that it's a model. Should never pretend to be a human. Deception should never happen. These sound like sort of beginning to get towards sort of regulatory ideas.
And the declaration that you're interacting with an AI is actually a part of many regulations today, which I think is not a bad thing.
We started off by talking about the 4 different approaches that you see globally towards regulation and the sort of experiment that they're effectively running in real time. Do you think that we're going to get to a point where international bodies will collaborate on AI regulation, or do you think that we'll sort of stay in this situation where different regions of the world approach it differently?
There are different attempts at international collaboration through the OECD, which is not all of the countries in the world, through the UN, through the G7. So there are these nascent attempts to try to figure out what are the sort of the overarching rules that we want to make sure are true. Things like AI should benefit humanity. Very, very general, but still sort of some kind of at least indication to what we think the policy tonality should be. I think that there will be challenges here, and I think those challenges are exacerbated by geopolitical pressures and tensions. They're also exacerbated by the fact that there is a lot of national competitiveness involved. And so we're not in a period of human history where multilateral institutions are super strong. So while I'm very happy that we have these international collaborations and the early attempts, I'm not entirely sure how we progress from the very general agreements to, for example, limits on the use of AI in simple situations. Say that you wanted to take the European AI Act and say we should universally outlaw social scoring with AI. Would that work? Or are there countries that actually believe that social scoring is a net good? Well, there are. And so we should think through where are the areas where international collaboration can happen.
I mean, one place that has not yet sort of planted their flag about regulation at all is the UK. Do you think that when it does, it will end up being closer to the EU or to the US?
The sort of approach in the UK has been advertised by the new Labour government as something where they're going to put a UK AI bill out before the end of the year for consultation. And they're looking at a set of sort of narrow regulations that will put them closer to the US, I think, than to the EU, which is interesting in many different ways. And then I think they'll continue to push, and this I really think is important, they'll continue to push for the sectoral application of the rules. Because I think there's a lot of value in how a sector or a set of professionals work with this. I think it would be very, very valuable to have a set of nurses or teachers talk about what would make most sense to them in their professional day-to-day when it comes to the use of these technologies. That kind of normative regulation is actually really important. And if you can encourage that on top of whatever narrow regulation you believe is needed, I think you can actually progress in what is another objective of regulation, and that is the diffusion of the technology in the economy. One way to measure the effectiveness and the value of regulation is actually to look at how fast is this technology diffusing through the economy. And that's something that I think we don't discuss often enough, because technology diffusion also unlocks benefits and also unlocks welfare. And so as we look at different kinds of regulation, that's actually one, not the only, but one interesting metric to think through.
I mean, I think what's been really interesting about this conversation is that I don't feel as though there are any aspects of regulation where you're like, no, that's definitely a bad idea. I mean, it still sort of feels like you're open to all of the potential options on the table. I do wonder, though, in terms of, is that fair?
I have no real views, yes. No, but I do think there are bad things that you can do. And one of them is banning technology. Sure. I think that's always wrong, right? So there's like a hard line. You shouldn't ban technology because you don't know how it works. I also think it's probably wrong to try to regulate too much at the data level and say these data sets must be absolutely perfect, because I think that will be really, really hard to do. There are some aspects of that in the EU AI Act that I think will be really difficult, but can be cleared up through sort of government practice and implementation in different ways. But it is also, to be honest, a wide open field. And we need to not sort of foreclose any kind of the models we have, but explore them equally and figure this out as we go along.
But then on the flip side of that, what do you think is the most urgent thing that requires attention? I mean, this sort of the wait and see, slowly, nice and carefully is all good. But where do you see that there's the most urgency?
I think building the institutions, making sure we have the science that makes it possible for us to understand this technology, whether it's a single model or a network of models, making sure that there are ways of testing and benchmarking this system, not sitting and waiting, but constantly building up the public knowledge about these together with the private sector, I think is super important. I want regulatory curiosity, and I think that's actually where we have what we have in a lot of the different regions we described. Regulatory curiosity, understanding the technology, figuring out where are the levers that we could pull if we needed to pull them. What lever is better than another lever? Is it better to regulate the data, the algorithm, the system, the user, the deployment? Where in the value chain should we be? That regulatory curiosity is absolutely essential and urgent because the technology is developing so fast.
What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
That was a discussion that probably left us with more questions than answers. But I do think that one takeaway for me, anyway, is the extraordinary complexity that is involved in regulating this technology to allow for benefits while mitigating against harms. And there really aren't simple solutions here. There aren't any quick wins, no silver bullets, no ideas that are even guaranteed to continue to work across time. Everything is a balance here in every direction. But as hard as this will be to get right, the one thing we can be sure of, as Nicklas said, the only way to proceed without any risk of harms is to not proceed at all. You have been listening to Google DeepMind, the podcast, with me, Professor Hannah Fry. If you enjoyed that episode, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also find us on your favourite podcast platform. And we have got plenty more episodes on a whole range of topics to come. So do check those out too. See you next time.